So welcome to part 3 session on assessment in higher education. As mentioned earlier, in this particular session, I'll be talking about how to design rubrics, which is nothing but an objective marking guide. So before you start the course, the first thing we need to do is design the intended learning outcomes of the course. Once the intended learning outcomes are designed, the next thing is to decide on what sort of teaching learning activities you would use in the class to achieve those intended learning outcomes. Once the teaching learning activities have been designed, the next aspect of the course is planning the assessment, which requires once again designing various types of assessment tasks and aligning it with the intended learning outcome, which we have spoken about in the last 2 sessions. The important thing I wanted to highlight here is in a course which is usually a semester long or a 6 months long, it's a good idea to incorporate various types of assessment tasks and so that you can address diverse types of learners. For deeper learning, we usually encourage you to use assessment tasks like the research projects, oral presentation, be it a group or an individual activity, written assignments, critical appraisal, because with all of these sort of assessment tasks, students have to go much more beyond what has been covered in the class. They go through different resources, different literature, and then they achieve whatever the assessment task is designed for. So in terms of rubrics, now with all of these assessment tasks like given examples such as research projects or oral presentation or written assignments or critical appraisal, none of these marking would be an objective marking, which means if you compare these assessment tasks with fill in the blanks, match the following or multiple choice questions, those sort of assessment tasks have very clear objective way of marking. The answer is correct or incorrect. But with these types of assessment tasks, which is a written piece or an oral presentation for 10 or 15 minutes, it requires much more objective way of marking, and hence the use of rubrics becomes more important and critical here. Just to give you an example of an oral presentation, if you're as a teacher or an examiner, you're marking an oral presentation. It could be an individual presentation or a group oral presentation where students are using PowerPoint as a way to present their content. As an examiner, we usually mark them on their communication skills, on presentation slide along with the content which they are delivering. The key thing here is student needs to be informed well in advance that they are not going to be marked just on the content or the topic or the task which has been given to them, but there are various other criteria which we are going to use for marking, and that needs to be shared with student 2 weeks in advance. So when we design the rubric, the important 2 things we are taking into account here. One, we are making this process of what is expected from students and giving them that information much in advance so that they use the rubrics to come well prepared for the assessment. And B, while using the rubric, even though there could be 1 examiner or 2 examiner, by using those marking guide, we are trying to make this process as objective as possible and minimize the subjectivity or the subjective bias. So as I've highlighted here, try to share, once you have designed the rubrics, you should be sharing this with students minimum 2 weeks in advance so that they come well prepared. Looking into this example again of oral presentation, what I wanted to highlight here that as an examiner, we do have all the criteria in our head. Now, if a student does a presentation or to be specific oral presentation here, and I give the feedback to students that I have marked you less on your communication skill, you need to improve on your communication skill. Whereas if there are 2 assessors, the second examiner informs the student that your communication skill was excellent. Now, if you think from student's perspective, student doesn't know first why there is difference between examiner 1 and examiner 2. Most likely, this is the subjective difference between what I think as an average, the other examiner might think as an excellent. So here the student is not benefiting out of our feedback because student is confused whether the communication was appropriate or it needs improvement. B, when I say that you need to improve on your communication skill, student really need to know which aspect of communication skill I need to improve. Do I need to improve on the nonverbal part, which includes the body language, eye contact, or do I need to improve on the verbal aspect of my communication skill, which is about my language, the pace, the tone which I am talking. So if you look into it, there are many different criteria and aspects on which we are assessing students' presentation. But if we don't make it clear to student well in advance, as well as when we give the feedback of what really needs to be improved and where they could make change next time, student is at loss here. And that's exactly what the purpose of this objective marking guide is, to lay down these criteria very clearly and then share it with student in advance so that they come well prepared. So oral presentation was just a very generic example. We need to incorporate this for all of these assignments where it could be research project or written assignment, which is, we are talking about any piece which is more than 500 words. So now how do we start designing rubrics? As I said, as an examiner, we all have our criteria on which we are going to mark a student. So the first and the most important thing is to list down all the specific criteria on which you are going to use, for marking. So going back to the same example of oral presentation, during an oral presentation, I will be using criteria like the content, the introduction, how well the student presents the introduction, communication skill. I will be also marking them on their presentation style, which includes how well or legible the PowerPoint slides are, how clear they are with their explanation, how well do they address question and answers, and how well they maintain their presentation within the given time limit. So these are all the criteria on which I am marking. My criteria might be slightly different to another examiner. The important thing is not that there is a one standard set of criteria for any assessment. The important thing here is whatever is my criteria, if I am the examiner, students need to know what those criteria are. Hence, when you're designing this rubric, write down the criteria, and once I show you the example, that will be more clear, and usually the practice is to write it on the left hand side and list down all the criteria. Now for each of these criteria, the next thing is to set level. So just take one example of communication skill. If I'm marking on the communication skill, I need to set different levels like excellent, good, average or poor, and then describe what does excellent communication skill mean, how excellent is different to good, average and poor. The benefit of doing this is, and writing it down when you're designing a rubric, is that if you're having 2 or 3 examiner, they can use those description to exactly determine what is excellent communication skill here, what is good and what is average. Another benefit of laying criteria and then setting level is you are now clear about how you are going to divide or grade the student. I would encourage you to have minimum of 3 levels or maximum of 5 level. The reason is if you go beyond 5 different level, it will be very hard to give description in an objective way for each of these level. How do you differentiate excellent from distinction and then good? You really need to be very clear about it. And if you go less than 3 level, then you're really dividing the class under just 2 broader categories where it's either good or it's bad, and that doesn't help the students very much. So the first thing is laying down the criteria. For each of these criteria, then setting different levels, and as I said, restrict either 3 levels or 5 level. Once you have given the criteria and the level, we then need to decide what weightage are we going to give for each of these criteria. And just to give you an example, for an oral presentation, going back to the same example, you might have for 100 marks, you might give 50% weightage to the content and the research work which they have done. And you might like only to give 10% weightage to the communication skill or 10% to the presentation slide. There is no hard and fast rule that all the criteria need to have equal weightage or different weightage. It's totally up to you to decide what is more important. Are you going to give equal weightage to all criteria, or you're going to divide different criteria based on the priority? The point here is, once again, let the students know what the different weightage is for each of those criteria. So when they are preparing, they know that maximum marks have gone to the content or the research work, and then the communication skill or the presentation slide have 10% or 5% weightage, whatever you choose to put it. I am going to go through one of the example used, or rather it's an open website on Carnegie Mellon University website, and I'm going to use that to show how a rubric looks like. I'll show you the different criteria, the different level, and how the weightage has been distributed. So if we look on here, this is about an oral presentation, and if you, as I mentioned earlier, if you see on the left hand column is the criteria. The different criteria which you are looking here are the research, the content of presentation, and I'll move to the next slide, which is communication as well as the self-evaluation, or what we call as reflection. Going back again, now for each criteria, let's just take the example of research. For research, this particular rubrics has used 3 different levels. The topmost level is sophisticated, which has got 3 points, or the weightage is 3 here if you go for the excellent or sophisticated level. The middle one is the competent, and not yet competent comes with 1 point. So these are the different levels, and since you don't see any different weightage on each of these criteria, what is in this particular rubric has been used is same weightage for each of these criteria. When you start designing this rubric, you will find, because you have used these criteria in past to mark any sort of these assessment, writing criteria would be much more easier, and then giving different levels based on what your requirements are would be relatively trivial. The key aspect here is, and what you would require some practice is, writing the descriptions for each of these criteria and for each of these levels. If you look and concentrate on the left hand side column on the research aspect, in research the examiner here is looking at the quality. Quality, where the student has used various sources, evaluated and validated these sources, and used accurate information for the presentation. The other aspect in terms of research, what the examiner is looking is that the broad coverage of information. So this is from the history subject, and the examiner wants the student to cover research in the areas of political, economical, social, as well as historical relevance. And when you look at the descriptions within each of these levels, the sophisticated, competent, and not yet competent, what you notice is sophisticated is, which is the highest one, the examiner here is looking that the information is accurate, resources are legitimate, and resources are varied when appropriate, as well as the student has used all 5 dimensions of, or rather all the 5 dimension to demonstrate the broad spectrum of research which has been used for this particular presentation. Now, to differentiate this from the middle level or the competent level, as you would read, the information is mostly accurate rather than accurate, and with only few minor errors, and includes 4 or 5 of these dimensions rather than all the 5 dimensions. Whereas when it comes to poor, it includes 3 or less of these dimensions. So this is what I was referring to, is being very specific and clear on each of these descriptions for each criteria. The benefit here is, now if you give this to student 2 weeks in advance when they are preparing for the oral presentation, they very well know what aspects I'm supposed to research, how broad it needs to be, and the articles and the material which I'm going to use needs to be from a reliable, valid source. And if I have used all the 5 aspects in my research, then I am at the excellent or the sophisticated level. So they will prepare based on the information what has been given to them in the rubric or the marking guideline. When the presentation happens, and once again, if we have 1 or 2 examiner, the examiner will be using the same rubric to mark the student presentation, and for each criteria, reading that description, that subjective bias is taken care of. I have to admit it won't be 100% free of bias, because as humans we do have some form of subjectivity, but we aim here is to minimize that subjective bias. So the student will be using, the examiner will be using these marking rubric guide to mark where the students stand for each of these criteria. In terms of weightage, in this particular example, as I said, the excellent one goes 3 points, competent 2 points, and not yet competent at 1 point. And then once you have marked for each criteria at different levels, you can just do the total to give the final mark. And when you give this feedback to the student, for student it's very clear. If I have marked them on their content of presentation criteria as competent, I need not write now a detailed descriptive feedback to tell them where they missed the points and what they have done well, but student can read this description clearly and get a clear feedback of why they got a particular level and what needs to be done next time around. Moving forward, the same thing holds true for the example which I gave earlier. If you are looking at communication skill, just telling them your communication skill is excellent or average or poor does not help student much. So if you have clarified and written in your rubric that you're looking at clarity, you're looking at style, where clarity refers to how well the ideas are explained, how integrated the ideas are with the slides, doesn't use jargon, demonstrate knowledge of key points, and respond well to question. Once again, it's totally up to you. If you want to put question and answer as a separate criteria, then you're very free to do so. This is just an example, and the key point is whatever your criteria is, if you are the examiner, student needs to know how those criteria are going to be used in terms of assessment. So what's the benefit of using these robust rubric? Most importantly, it gives clarity to students of what is expected out of them. And this is what I spoke at the start. In designing assessment in higher education, we need to be transparent. Transparent in terms of making sure that the assessment tasks are designed in alignment with the intended learning outcome. But when it comes to any of these piece of assessment tasks like written assignment, oral presentation, we need to ensure students are very clear on what different criteria they are going to be marked on and what is expected out of them. It also improves learning through detailed objective feedback, which once again I want to highlight, which I did in my first part, is the whole point of formative assessment, which is assessment for learning, is to give them detailed feedback. Only when we give detailed feedback, students learn out of that feedback of where they went well, what they did not do well, and what needs to be changed next time. The Other thing about designing these rubric is it's a time-saving task for teachers. You might initially think that so far I have been marking written assignments based on what all criteria I have. I don't have to design a rubric, but trust me, once you design this rubric and you're dealing with a class of 60 or 100 students, giving them a systematic, consistent feedback will become much more time-saving task, because as I suggested earlier, if you use an online forum like Moodle, you can attach these form of rubrics to each assignment when you're marking it online. Or if you're using a hard copy, you can first take a printer of these rubrics, share it with student 2 weeks in advance, and if they are submitting, suppose, a written assignment, ask them to attach this along with their submitted assignment, and you as an examiner or other 2 examiners, if you have, can use this rubric to mark and grade them. When you do so, because each of these criteria and levels comes with a well described description, or rather detailed description, students get consistent feedback rather than me giving 4-line feedback to one particular student and 2-line feedback to another student. Hence, as I said, it's a time-saving task once the rubric has been designed. It provides consistency in marking. So, once again, consistency in marking in me marking student 1 to student 2 all the way up to if I have 50 students, as well as if there is 2 or 3 examiners, we all would be using the same marking guide to mark different students. And this is once again I mentioned about our assessments in higher education needs to be reliable, and this is what, by designing such objective marking guide, we are making this assessment as a more reliable and a robust one. And also the most important about formative assessment task is not just detailed feedback, but detailed timely feedback. And by using this, it's, as I said, it's a time-saving task. You will be in a position to provide feedback to students for all of these sort of assessment tasks in much timely manner. And once again, I would promote you to provide those feedback within the 2 week of submission, because students really need to get those feedbacks so they can work and improve their learning, and that's how they are going to benefit. This brings me to the end of my 3-part session on assessment in higher education. These are the few references which I have used for preparing this material. I would like you to go through these, and thank you very much for your time.